Hello and welcome to another week of Quarantine Sunday School. The topic for today's discussion is going to be Alma, chapters 23 through 29. I'm going to focus primarily on chapters 23 and 24. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, and is my want, we're just going to kind of deep dive into those chapters rather than trying to cover at a high level the entire content in support of your own personal scripture study, your own personal worship. So let's dive into it. One of the things, maybe we could take just a quick step backwards to chapter 22. We find a nice geography lesson that's thrown in there, but the important thing is we have Ammon converting King Lamoni's father. When we start to look at just the politics of it, we see there's King Lamoni, but then there's his father, the great king or high king. That would certainly imply that there were multiple tribal chieftains or kings or lesser kings that would roll up to this high king, and that we start to see some of the challenges that are faced by the people of Nephi, Lehi later, especially in chapters 24 and onward, are a result of maybe that political structure. So we'll get into that, but the important thing to point out is that King Lamoni's father, the high king or great king, was converted to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so that's kind of starts off with what we see in chapter 23. Now it came to pass, this is verse 1, that the king of the Lamanites sent a proclamation among all his people that they should not lay hands on Ammon and Aaron, or Amner or Himni, nor either of their brethren. So, their companions. We know it wasn't just the four of them who should go forth preaching the word of God in whatsoever place they should be. And with that, we can keep going, right? You're not going to throw stones at them. You're not going to cast them out of your synagogues. You're not going to spit on them. You're not going to do all these things. The end of verse 2, but that ye should have free access, or they should have free access to their houses and also their temples and their sanctuaries. And thus they might go forth and preach the word according to their desires, for the king had been converted unto the Lord and all his household. I am going to stop there because it's probably important to point out with this proclamation that the king sent out to all of his people, not just his direct tribal group, but also for the sub kings or lesser kings, or whatever term we want to use for them, tribal chieftains that rolled up to him. It's that we see a protection for these missionaries, right? The sons of Mosiah and all those who were with them. Protection against punishment, against abuse. That's the first thing. The second thing that this proclamation provides is access. And they describe it as their houses, their temples, their synagogues, right? Their sanctuaries. Wherever it is that people meet, whether that's in their home, or whether that's in their, whatever their churches or places of worship were, whatever they were worshiping, it's essentially wherever people gather. So he's essentially removing any sorts of obstacles to the teaching, and it's pretty inclusive of any place that you could imagine as we start to look at it. And that's interesting, and that's kind of cool, especially if you're the missionary and you're saying, hey, wow, we've gone to this hostile kingdom, we've converted the leader, and the leader is saying, go teach my people. And that's carte blanche, isn't it? But there's probably one thing to point out. And by the way, that's kind of how Christian missionaries worked in ancient times. And so when we look at the missionaries that would go out from this again, right after Rome became Christianized with Constantine in 325 AD, missionaries were sent out to the Germanic peoples, the Gauls, the people of Britain, and in order to bring them in alignment. And where they would start was exactly where Alma went out, right, to the king Lamoni to visit with those people, and you would even see this even through the medieval period with the Christian conversions of the Viking peoples, the great pagans from the north, where you look at Harold Hardrada, and he became Christianized and compelled his people to join the Christian faith with him. And you have this, this top-down sort of conversion. The king is converted, therefore we must all be converted. But what didn't happen in those cases were that the rank and file, the grassroots people, while they would technically be baptized and show some sort of Christian conversion, the reality was they weren't. And so the old gods and the old ways and the pagan rites were still practiced. And that's where you saw the need of the Christians to co-opt so many of the pagan holidays, whether that's the birthday of Sol Invictus, right? The incomparable sun, which necessitated a move of Christmas from the spring into December 25th, which was to co-opt that birthday, or taking Christmas trees and Christianizing those, even though those were from pagan rites, and the winter solstice and All Saints Day quickly following, the Day of the Dead, which, by the way, when we say Day of the Dead, right, that's kind of the Mexican holiday, but there was a pagan rite called Samhain, which happened on October 31st, which was a Celtic celebration, which is very similar to that Day of the Dead. And then we follow that quickly with All Saints Day in order to, provide the yin to the yang, so to speak. And so, all of that stuff would have happened because, the king was converted, but when you prescribe or when you command your people to become converted as well, it rarely happens when you're conscribed, when you're told you are now Christian or you now need to go be baptized. Is there really a true conversion that happens? And that's where you see here in this proclamation, what you don't see here, I guess, is probably more appropriate, is some sort of command from the king. There's no compulsion issued here to join the church. The king never says you have to be baptized. What the king says is that I'm going to remove all the obstacles in place so that the message can be preached, and then you can do with it as you will, join or not. So it is clear that King Lamoni's father, and we never hear his name, maybe it wasn't a cool name, or maybe it was something that would have really put Mike Stover in a bad spot trying to pronounce it. I don't know. But what we never get his name, but he also seems to understand that a true conversion has to come from that person. It has to be more of a grassroots type of conversion. We have to feel that in our heart. And so these missionaries, while they knocked down all the obstacles for them, they created a safe environment for them to teach. There was never a compulsion to join the church. Now, they have a great deal of success, but that's because the message was received. It's not because they were forced to receive it. And so that's, so what's important here in these first 3 to 4 verses is not just what's there, but what's not there. And I really wanted to point that out, because it comes into play later as we understand the depth of that conversion, and that can only come from a bottom-up grassroots sort of conversion, when these people are truly changed versus a compulsion too. Because if you're forced into a particular religious thought, and then now they're saying, okay, you have to go out and lay down your life for that, are you really going to do it? Are you really that converted? I'm not that converted. So we see that this agency was necessary in order for these people to get to that level of true conversion, of experiencing that mighty change in their heart. And we start to see that, see that build in verse 6. And as sure as the Lord liveth, and this is the great Semitic oath, basically saying you can really believe me. It's not just on my eyes or on my children or on my mother, kind of oath. It's on God. As surely as the Lord liveth, so sure, as many as believed, or as many as were brought to the knowledge of the truth through the preachings of Alma and his brethren, according to the spirit of revelation and of prophecy, and the power of God working miracles in them. Yea, I say unto you, as the Lord liveth. We get two oaths in the same verse, which he's really basically saying, yea, listen to me. As many of the Lamanites as believed in their teachings and were converted, again, there's that agency. So you have to hear it, you have to believe it, you have to be converted. Were converted unto the Lord, never did fall away, for they became a righteous people. And so that's how that true conversion has to happen. It has to happen within the soul of each person. It has to happen through agency, not compulsion. It has to happen because the Spirit of the Lord witnesses to our spirits, and our spirits accept that, and then we make a decision to commit ourselves to that belief structure, to that belief pattern. It has nothing to do with the missionaries. It has everything to do with them creating an introduction to the Spirit. And when that happens, and when they hear it, acknowledge it, receive it, and commit to it, that's when a true conversion occurs. And that's what every missionary wants. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's that momentary conversion. They're caught up in the emotions of the moment, but that doesn't last. But not in this case. In this case, never did fall away, is what is described. As many as joined, never did fall away. So this was a true conversion by a lot of different people. We see the flip side to this coin as well. If we skip down to verse 14, and the Amalekites were not converted, save only one. So I guess we get one of them. One lone survivor. Neither were any of the Amulonites, Mike. There you go. But they did harden their hearts, and also the hearts of the Lamanites in that part of the land whatsoever they dwelt. So it had the inverse effect on these people, right? These former Nephites who kind of left Dodge and went. And you see that with any kind of change. Any kind of change is going to have an impact. Some people don't want that change. I'm here because of the party. Why are you now joining yourself to this religion that I left the Nephite peoples because of? And so you see that, and that's always going to be the case whenever there's some sort of a social change. And in this case, we can view it within the lens of a religious change as well. We'll get into more of that as we get into chapter 24. But this is kind of from verse 16 through verse 18. This is where we start to see that, hey, well, what are we going to call ourselves? We don't want to call ourselves Lamanites because the connotation of that, going back centuries, by the way, right? Because we're now in 90 to 77 BC. So going back centuries, the Lamanites had a stigma associated with them, and they want to move away from that. And so they have this conversation, and they decide to call themselves the anti-Nephi Lehis, because they no longer wanted to be called Lamanites. And then so that certainly begs the question of what's an anti-Nephi Lehi, and I have a couple of different responses to that, but the reality is we don't know. We don't know what that is. And in the big Book of Mormon, Book of Mormon Reference Companion, it says that, let me find it, that, sorry about that. The name anti-Nephi Lehi or anti-Nephi Lehi may be a reflex of the Egyptian NTY, or which translates to he of, or the one of. Thus, rather than making it a sense of against, it has a meaning of one of Nephi Lehi, joining themselves to the people. In another commentary, kind of my go-to, which is the doctrinal commentary of the Book of Mormon, they kind of look at it as a possibility of a couple different things. It says it is not clear exactly why they called themselves the anti-Nephi Lehis, viewing the word anti as meaning opposed to or against. Perhaps their action symbolizes a desire to dissolve barriers between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and thus establishing peace. The name could, in this sense, represent their opposition to a Nephite-Lamanite distinction. That is, they wanted neither Nephite nor Lamanite nor any manner of ites, which is what they did arrive at in Fourth Nephi, right? In the golden age of, post Jesus's visit, they did get to that point. Another possibility, and getting back to the commentary, another possibility suggests itself. The Webster's Dictionary of 1828 indicates that the word anti or anti means like or mirror image of. In that case, the Antichrist would mean not just opposed to Christ, but also deceptively similar to Christ. And perhaps the name anti-Nephi Lehi would symbolize their desire to be as Nephi and Lehi of old. That is, that they might remember the goodness and faithfulness of the first Nephite prophet and leaders. So there's that. Who knows really what it means, what it could mean. That's not part of the description in the record here. So we're forced into conjecture. There's some good ideas. You can take them, you can leave them, you can choose to not worry about it. It's really up to you. You get to choose your own adventure when it comes to the appropriate meaning. The important thing is whatever they called themselves, they as a people changed significantly. In verse 18, we see that they become a very industrious people, and they were friendly with the Nephites. Therefore, they did open correspondence, and you would assume trade as well with the Nephites. So they no longer became, as was described just a few chapters ago, as a violent people, as a warlike people who chose to come and steal things rather than make it themselves, kind of thing. And so they no longer raided to get their stuff, to get their food, to get their material items. They were now industrious in their own way. So we see the gospel of Jesus Christ having a significant impact on these people and on the whole future of this people on a macro perspective. So we can see it from a micro change as well as a macro change within these people. So a lot of good stuff going on there, and we can see the gospel at work. So key themes are going to be, obviously a hearing of the message, an agency, and then that macro change that can happen. Now, that there's, as we talked about, there's always two sides to the coin, and this revival that's going on with the Lamanites, the pure-blooded Lamanite people, wasn't super well received by those hybrid peoples, the Amalekites and Amulonites. And they're not so excited because they came over to the Lamanites to get away from this whole thing. And so they start to create rebellion in the land. Verse 1, and it came to pass that the Amalekites and Amulonites and the Lamanites who were in the land of Amalon and also in the land of Helam and so on, right? They were in the land of Jerusalem and in the land round about, so skipping ahead, had not been converted and had not taken upon them the name of anti-Nephi Lehi, were stirred up by the Amalekites and by the Amulonites to anger against their brethren. And their hatred became exceedingly sore against them, even insomuch as they began to rebel against their king, insomuch that they would not that he should be their king. Therefore, they took up arms against the people of Anti-Nephi-Lehi. And verse 3, and the king conferred the kingdom upon his son. He'd had enough. He was out. And he called his name. So he changed his name to Anti-Nephi-Lehi. And then verse 4, the king died. So he's obviously at end of life. He doesn't have the energy to fight this anymore. But I do want to go back, because anytime there's going to be a significant social change, there's always going to be agitators. Whether that's we don't like the direction of what this change is going to, or whether it's we don't want any kind of change. Things are awesome the way they were. We don't want to have any kind of change. We want to stay right here where we are. And if we look at this from the lens of religion, or the battle between good and evil, or light and darkness, what we can see clearly at hand is a tug of war between light and dark, right? Between the people of God and then the people who are not of God. Whether we want to call them anti-religion, or anti-establishment, or anti-science, right? Climate deniers, whatever we want to call them, right? There's going to be this tug of war that happens, and we can see it today going on throughout the world, and whether that's science versus religion, whether that's capitalism versus communism and fascism. There's going to be this light and dark, and this tug of war that happens. And so as we see society being kind of tugged or pushed back and forth across that spectrum, we see it here. And we can look at it through a political lens as well. If we look at a high king who is suddenly making a change where the lower kings or chieftains aren't necessarily in line with, well, what's going to happen with that? I think it's always going to be the case that every lower king who feels like they should be the higher king, and so they're going to look at any opportunity or any perceived weakness in order to assert their own claim or their own primacy. And so, again, if we look at it from the lens of religion, this is a light and dark sort of thing. But if we look at it from the lens of politics, what we see is now a perceived weakness by those more militant folks, the Amulonites and the Amalekites, right? That they want things to be a certain way, and they perceive this change to be weakness. And so now this is the opportunity to strike. And you see that throughout history as well. Every time there was a transition of authority in any kingdom that there's ever been a record of, there's upheaval. You can go all the way back to the Assyrians and to the Persians as Cyrus died there and his son took over, and then Darius took over from him through some sort of subterfuge, right? There was machinations that go on because Darius felt like he would have been a better king and should be the king of the Persians, and eventually became a great king of the Persians. Although it did take some assassinations and some military conflict. And you see that, again, throughout history. Every time there was a transition from the old republic to the emperors, within Rome, within each emperor's ascension because of the death or murder of a predecessor, you see things happening. And when there's trouble over in Parthia, the legions go there. That means now there's trouble over here because the Germanic peoples can see that it's all quiet because the legions are there. Now it's time for us to make our move. And so you spend your time dealing with the fact that everybody thinks that they should be the king. And so again, it really depends on the lens with which we want to view this situation. Or if we want to just kind of look at it and say, all right, we have now a social revolution that's going on. You see the king and the king's son in the case of Lamoni, and many of the Lamanites being converted to this new religion, or new religion to them, although ancient, and it's changing the way they perceive their centuries of tradition that have come down since the time of Laman and Lemuel. And they're seeing the error of their ways, and they're making this mighty change, and they're transitioning to becoming industrial people, building their own homes, getting their own food, and as opposed to being hunter-gatherers and raiders stealing the food of the Nephites. And so you see a whole lot of transition, and it would one would expect this to be the outcome, is going to be a rebellion from powerful chieftains who see this as weakness, or who don't want to change, or who feel like they could do it better if only they were the Hyde kings. And so we see this transition that's going on. So now that it's going to come to an internal rebellion, or a civil war, so to speak, how do we dress it? And in verse 5, we see that there's a council on how to respond. And in verse 6, now there was not one soul among all the people who had been converted unto the Lord that would take up arms against their brethren. Nay, they would not even make any preparations for war. Yea, and also their king commanded them that they should not. And so now we have leadership, and I don't think they're dumb. You have this warlike people. They know themselves, and they know their brethren, these other tribal chieftains over here. They know exactly how they're going to respond, because just yesterday that was them. They would have responded in exactly the same way. But they're saying, the king says, now these are the words which he said unto the people concerning the matter. I thank my God, my beloved people, that our great God has in goodness sent these our brethren the Nephites to us, to preach unto us, and to convince us of the traditions of our wicked fathers. And behold, I thank my great God that he has given us a portion of his spirit to soften our hearts, that we have opened a correspondence with these brethren, the Nephites. And also, I thank my God that we be convinced of the sins and of the many murders which we have committed. And it probably should point out that when we start to look at this, redemption from murder, many of the commentators have pointed out that this was not redemption from a capital or premeditated murder, that this was more has to do with killing in an unrighteous war-like setting where they weren't really aware that they were on the wrong side of it. So I don't know how we would classify that now, as far as in the criminal code, but they do call out that it is not a premeditated or first-degree murder according to the laws of our land now. And also I thank my God, verse 10, yea, that he hath granted unto us that we might repent and of these things, and also that he hath forgiven us of those our many sins. And I really like how he's had the turn of the phrase in verse 11. He says, and it's halfway down, and to get God to take them away from our hearts. For it was all we could do to repent sufficiently before God, that he would take away our stain. Take them away from our hearts it's a beautiful turn of phrase as far as I'm concerned. As I look at it, I see this could be multifaceted. That what we're seeing is a true conversion where their hearts have been changed, right? That have you not received a mighty change of heart? Have you not received his image in your countenance? And we talk about the fact that they get to a point where they have no more desire to do evil. And I see that here. Take them away from our hearts, right? This is no longer something that we want. We are now changed. But I also can see this as understanding what true forgiveness is. That any sin can leave a scar on our heart or on our soul, and it also can mean that, right? That it's not just a matter of we have no more desire to do evil, but that it's removing that scar tissue from our hearts that all sins can leave. And so it's God forgiving us, but also us forgiving us, that we acknowledge that the atonement is real, that we accept that we can be forgiven, and that we then forgive ourselves as we forsake those sins. And that so often is is the challenge, and I've talked about it a million times, is it's not just God forgiving us, but us finding a way to forgive ourselves as well. And that's how I see this. You could see it differently, but I really view this as an understanding of the true nature of forgiveness here, and we see this, that they're fully converted. And he goes on and on, about all the things that God has done for them, and the mercy of God, that they might not perish spiritually. A spiritual death is what they're talking about here. And verse 16, they go in and they now where they make the commitment to hide their swords away deep in the earth. Verse 17, we clarify, I suspect, hunting would still be a part of their lives. And so having spears and swords and, well, not necessarily swords, but daggers and bows and arrows would be necessary. And so they call it out that they're really just anything that they use to kill man. Anything that has man's blood on it would have been buried deep in the earth. And then verse 19, let's skip ahead. And thus we see that when the Lamanites were brought to believe and to know the truth, they were firm and would suffer even unto death rather than commit a sin. And so we see the full nature of their commitment. I don't know that I would be so devout in this exact same situation. If I know that there's somebody who's coming to take my life, my fight or flight response has always been fight, and that's not always been a good thing. It hasn't always ended well, but that seems to be my own personal nature, and so we can see here that they. And by the way, they weren't forced into this. Or they had a council, and everybody agreed that we would rather die than lose our opportunity for redemption. That's how significant that was for them. Now, the question could be, should we all adopt this approach? Is this a primer for a conscientious objector position when it comes to defending our country now? And the answer to that can become a very personal one for you. I perceive this as the answer being no from a macro perspective. We see that because their own children's, when they were ready to take up arms later and go back on this commitment, their own children said, no, you can't do that. But we didn't make this commitment, so we'll go to war in your place, right? And then we have the sons of Helaman. And so when we look at this, what we see is a very personal commitment. And so I would say the answer, if we look at this as a primer for conscientious objection, I would say the answer is yes for them. But that doesn't necessarily mean yes for everyone. And it wasn't yes for their children, but it was absolutely yes for these people in this generation, and to the peril, right? To their peril, should they pick up the swords, because they made this commitment to God. And when that happens, it's more important to keep that commitment. So we see that. And verse 20, 21, it starts, right? The battle is upon us. And in verse 21, now the people saw that they were coming against them. They went out to meet them and prostrate themselves before them to the earth and began to call on the name of the Lord. And thus they were in this attitude when the Lamanites began to fall upon them and began to slay them with the sword. Willingly, they willingly walked forward, prostrate. Now, whether that's on their knees or on their face, it was very common to lay down and prostrate yourself fully, face onto the ground. In the Semite culture, we in our Western thought would think that would be odd, but that's kind of within Egypt, within Jerusalem, within Assyria, Persia. That would have been the approach that would have carried forward with them. And we find out that 1,005, which is oddly specific, of them were killed, which oddly specific, but also a lot. I mean, that's a lot of people murdered. Now, and murdered without defense, just basically going out, kneeling before them or laying before them and praying to God. And then the Lamanites began to murder them without any sort of response. And that has an impact as well. Um, in fact, verse 24, now when the Lamanites saw this, they did forbear from slaying them, and there were many whose hearts were swollen in them for those of their brethren who had fallen under the sword, for they repented of the things which they had done. When we start to look at war killing, there's a certain psychology to it, that the impact that it has on the killer versus the killee, right? The person who wins versus the person who loses has, and the impact that has more to do with proximity than the actual ending of a life. Meaning that if you push a button from a submarine miles and miles away, which launches some sort of cruise missile that goes into some pre-described target, hundreds of miles away, and destroys that target, and any persons or humans that are by it or in it, doesn't leave the same scar as somebody who's dropping a bomb from 30,000 feet, which doesn't leave the same scar as somebody who is shooting 200 yards across a battlefield, which doesn't leave the same scar as somebody who is up close and personal in the shield wall, stabbing at their opponent and feeling their last breath, so to speak. So when we start to look at this is a war killing of proximity, right? They're right there, and they get out and they start hacking them to pieces and killing them. And I apologize for the bluntness of this, but I'm trying to communicate, just the viciousness of this moment. Killing an unarmed opponent, there's no honor in it, and we see that it starts to have an impact on those Lamanites who were doing the killing, to the point where it says their hearts were swollen and they began to regret this and repent of this thing that they had done, because it's right there in front of them and it's happening. Now, there's always going to be those people who don't respond in that way. We would like to think that we would all respond in that way of seeing their suffering and connecting to that suffering, having empathy for it, and then responding in a positive way once we recognize that it's wrong. But that doesn't happen to all the people. There are always going to be those people who are hardened even more by that, and in this case, it's the Amalekites and the Ammonites, and specifically those. And I like this. It called out who were the order of the Nahors, right? So we have now these people who had been raised to light, who had been raised under true religion and had turned away from it, and those are the people who didn't stop from a killing perspective. In this case, those are the people whose hearts were hardened and they grew to more and more hatred, as opposed to having the compassion that the Lamanites, the pure-blooded Lamanites, had in this particular case. And I don't know what the order of the Nahors. I mean, obviously, we know who Nahor was, and we understand, that. And it's kind of funny. You look at it and you say, okay, when we look at a historical precedence for that, would there be, and is there still? And the answer is absolutely. You see, different branches of the military, right? If you look at Nazi Germany, just because you were in the Wehrmacht, right, the Nazi army, doesn't necessarily mean that you were a party subscriber. You could have been conscribed and put into the army and gone and told to defend your country, and that's what you did. That's very different from those people who joined the Waffen SS, the Death Head Brigade, right? Those people who were out specifically to kill the Jews and those lesser peoples, the Slavic peoples, as far as that goes. So would it be possible to be a part of the German army, but not part of that group who was responsible for killing the Jews in the Holocaust? Yeah. Were there good people in the German army who were caught up just by, whatever, right? The chance of being born into Germany at that time and being conscribed into the military and fighting for your country? Yeah. Yeah, there were good people who were caught up in that, as is always the case. Yeah, and you can see that in any sort of political structure where there are those nationalists and those fanatics. Not every Japanese soldier who were marching, the prisoners from Bataan on the death march were abusing those soldiers, but a lot of them were. They were super nationalistic and super patriotic to the point of of abuse, and so that's kind of what we're seeing here as well. That not everybody was a bad person. They were caught up in that moment when they started on this atrocity, on this war crime, to put it into the modern parlance. It softened their hearts, and they received a witness of and forgiveness for these acts, and they joined themselves with these people. They joined themselves with the light. But then there's always going to be those that don't, and that's what we see in verse 30. And thus we can plainly discern that after a people have been once enlightened by the Spirit of God and have had great knowledge of things pertaining to righteousness, and then have fallen away into sin and transgression, they become more hardened, and thus their state becomes worse. And though they, worse than though they had never known these things. And we see it today. There's an idiom that's out there that the people can leave the church, but they can't leave it alone, so to speak. And that's a similar message to what Joseph Smith had a conversation with a person named Isaac Behunin, and Isaac was basically talking to Joseph Smith, and he's like, "Why do people, that leave the church, always fight against it? If I ever left the church, I would just go find some place where the church wasn't and be left, and live my life quietly." And Joseph Smith replies, "Brother Behunin, you don't know what you would do. No doubt these men once thought as you. Before you joined the church, you stood on neutral ground. When the gospel was preached, good and evil were set before you. You could choose either or neither." I guess either or neither, or either or neither. I've heard it both ways. There were two opposite masters inviting you to serve them. When you joined this church, you enlisted to serve God. When you did that, you left the neutral ground, and you can never get back to it. Should you forsake the master you enlist to serve, it will be by the instigation of the evil one, and you will follow his dictation and be his servant. So there it is. There's another way of saying it, right? That you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. And those who turn away from the light become the most dark and the most unwilling to see that light again, to join themselves or rejoin themselves to it. They become an enemy to all that is good and righteous, and that's what happens here. So I'm gonna end with that. There's a lot of good stuff, in these chapters and going forward. But the most important thing, at least for me, this time through, was seeing what it takes to be truly converted, and what that means and what that commitment level is. And we see that in these Lamanite peoples, and that they were so committed to this path, to this conversion, to this new way of life, that they would rather die than lose their chance at a spiritual redemption. This life meant nothing if they lose that redemption in the next life. And so they were absolutely willing to put their lives on the line for that. They had that level of devotion, and that's something that I aspire to, and I hope that we all do, in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.